Hello and welcome to GameSack. Working Designs has always been a fascinating publisher to me because they often brought out very interesting titles. Now, they were founded back in 1986 where they did mostly accounting software for the transportation industry. Suddenly, the chief programmer and co-founder, Todd Mark, died, and a fellow named Victor Ireland was hired to replace him and finish up the software, which took a few years. Victor claims to have been writing for the magazine called Video Games and Computer Entertainment when he made lots of Japanese contacts and developed an interest in bringing PC Engine games over to North America. He must have been uncredited or written under a pen name because I can find no evidence of him writing for this publication ever. Anyway, he formed a partnership with Sylvia Schmidt to change directions and focus on the games industry. So, let's take a look at all of their games. Parasol Stars came out first, near as I can tell, and it was released in the latter half of 1991 for the TurboGrafx-16. Working Designs brought it to North America as one of the very few third-party publishers for the console. This is one of those single-screen Taito games where you need to clear out all of the enemies and then move on to the next screen. Pretty basic, but it can be fun if you like this kind of stuff. This is a bit similar to Taito's other entries in the Bubble Bobble saga, but Parasol Stars here actually came out on the PC Engine and TurboGrafx-16 first. It was then ported to other platforms. I can never get much into games like these, but I think I'd like it a lot more if there were more than just a single continue. The graphics are pretty basic, but are fine for this style of game. It doesn't seem like Working Designs made any changes other than adding their logo to the game. Cadash? I think it's Cadash. Anyway, it followed very soon after Parasol Stars. It's also from 1991, also from Taito, and also for the TurboGrafx-16. It's Taito's port of their own arcade game. This one is an action RPG game. You hack and slash like an action game, but you also level up, stay at ends, upgrade your weapons, and buy items. Sometimes I think that this game is hurt more by its arcade legacy than helped by it. By that I mean there's no save points, no continues, yet each time you play you have to spend lots of time grinding. There is just so much potential here that I don't feel is realized because it originated in the arcades. You can't select items to use when you want, but rather they're used automatically. With patience, the game can become pretty easy, and once you're good at it, you may find that it's a bit on the short side. But you're not going to walk through this one the first few times you play it. Unlike the Genesis version of Cadash, you can choose from all 4 of the arcade characters. The graphics are bright, cartoonish, and overall I find them pleasant. The sound is a bit weak for the system, but not irritating. As far as the text translation goes, it seems to be very close to the arcade. In fact, I'm wondering if Taito did the translation for them, mainly evidenced by the European spelling of armor here. They didn't make any adjustments to the gameplay that I can notice by playing the Japanese version. Overall, it's a decent port of the arcade game. One moderately interesting trivial fact is that Taito sent both of these first 2 games to Working Designs over modem, and it took them overnight. Can you imagine back when the internet was so slow that these games took overnight? Exile was next for the TurboGrafx CD, and it came out in 1992. In fact, every single one of Working Designs games from here on out would be on disc. In Japan, this was an action RPG from Riot and Telenet, and Working Designs translated it for us to be able to play it here. You play as Sadler, and you hack and slash your way through different areas, much like Cadash. However, I feel that this is a better game overall. You also control RPG-like segments for the town scenes. You can save, buy, and use items at your discretion and everything else you'd expect in an RPG. Even though you have characters in tow, you only ever control Sadler. Working Designs actually did make a few changes to this game. For one, Gone is the warp spell that returns you to the start of any given stage. They also made some adjustments to the enemy difficulty, hoping to increase the challenge of the game, but it's still a piece of cake if you take the time to grind at the start, which is something I like to do anyway. This has an extra town compared to the Genesis version and, of course, CD quality music. The colors here are also much better. As for the translation itself, it tends to be pretty faithful to the Japanese version from what I can tell, though they did change things like drug to tonic. Working Designs did find the time to insert a tiny bit of their humor in here and there. There's one scene where Yuko from Valis tells you about Exile 2: The Revenge and how it's coming to the Super CD in the future. There's even another scene where a boss alludes to what would be Working Designs' next game. Overall, I enjoy this one, and it doesn't require a huge time investment like similar games might, and you can beat it in maybe only 2 or 3 hours. Working Designs' next release would be Cosmic Fantasy II for the TurboGrafx CD in 1992. This would be the company's first true RPG release. It's also the only one of the 4 Cosmic Fantasy games to make it outside of Japan. It's a fairly basic RPG from Telenet. You're Van, and you're off to rescue your girlfriend Laura, who just happens to be a secret princess. The battles are random, and the enemies appear over wherever you happen to be walking. They have no animation other than flashing when they get hit. RPG battles don't get more bare bones than this. These battles happen a lot, and it quickly becomes tedious and annoying. Still, the game is kind of addictive for me, and I powered through the entire thing back in the day. It starts out as most RPGs do, in a village surrounded by other fairly primitive villages, but eventually a whole cast of characters come in from other places and it gets pretty crazy. The translation in this one is absolutely littered with Working Designs humor. It is everywhere. Hell, it's almost surprising when a character doesn't try to say something funny. The cutscenes are lighthearted, and they don't try to push the humor too much. Actually, they're fairly enjoyable to watch and quite plentiful, nearly a half an hour's worth altogether. One change that Working Designs did make, though, is removing this single-fingered salute. That may be okay in Japan, but that does not fly here in America. At least not in video games. Overall, I think most people will find this game tedious, but I really enjoyed it in its time. Play it on an emulator or an ODE if you can to avoid the constant loading. Exile Wicked Phenomenon was next in 1993 for the TurboGrafx Super CD or Turbo Duo. As you've probably guessed, this is the sequel to Exile. It plays in a very similar fashion here, except now you walk extremely close to the edge of the screen. That's pretty exciting, but now you can also play as the 3 other characters that followed you around in the last game. You have to buy weapons and armor for each of them individually, but they share other items and all level up together. Thank goodness. The graphics are very similar to the first game, and so is the music, but it's all pretty good for the time. Working Designs decided to go a bit crazy with this one. The translation has a lot more of their trademark humor than the first Exile game, but that's certainly not its biggest sin. They adjusted the stats for every enemy in the game, giving them a lot more HP. The good news though is that you also take more damage. Nice! I'm being a smartass if you couldn't tell. As a result, the game is unreasonably hard. I don't know why they insist on making these rebalancing changes to these games. I guess they know better than the original designers. I talked about this one a lot more in the episode called Regional Differences too. Suffice it to say though, the game is almost broken. The good news, I'm not kidding this time, is that in most of the outdoor scenes they added a bit of parallax with scrolling clouds, which makes the visual presentation nicer than the Japanese original. It's too bad that they screwed up the gameplay so much because the Japanese original is quite fun, aside from walking so close to the edge of the damn screen. Also, while not technically a Working Designs release, they did help with Dungeon Explorer 2 on the Turbo Duo in 1993. NEC had them do the English voice recording for all of the cutscenes and other parts with voiceover. If you're familiar with their games, then you can certainly recognize some of the voices.
I will grant you your death.
Pretty cool if you ask me, which obviously you did since you're watching this video. I'm just kidding. Anyway, let's get back to their releases. Their last game for the TurboGrafx platform would come next in 1993 as Vasteel, which is a CD game. This is a rather boring strategy game, at least to me, and it's from Human and it has an even more boring story. I really liked this one the first time I played it, but then I played it again and I found that it just doesn't really hold up. This does win some points for having battles where you control yourself in real time on a close-up screen though. Otherwise, you take turns moving pieces around a map and buying more units to move around. Story-wise, it has two boring-ass brothers fighting a political battle over some useless solar system that nobody gives a rat's ass about. Seriously, the characters here could not be less interesting. Everything is voiced, but the sound quality is low and scratchy.
Step on. Your first campaign is about to begin.
Yes. Now that I've started this, I must win this war at any cost.
I'm not sure if working design screwed with the enemy stats making them tougher or not, though it does seem extremely easy for my troops to lose battles. I'm also not sure if they changed anything with the translation here, because it all seems pretty stiff and rigid. No, get your mind out of the gutter. There are many better titles on the platform that I wish they would have brought over instead of this one. Listening to department store music from the 1950s as I play certainly doesn't help. Working Designs shifted gears over to the Sega CD Christmas of 1993 with Lunar: The Silver Star. This is an RPG developed by Game Arts. You play as Alex, who is on his quest to become a Dragon Master. Everything feels very fluid with this one as the characters walk around pretty fast, which I like. Another thing that I enjoy is the intuitive menu system. The random battles are also nice with kind of an overhead/side view to them. Characters only have so much reach and can't attack an enemy until they're close enough, and vice versa. Well, that is unless your character has a projectile weapon or some good magic. Speaking of the random battles, their occurrences are very inconsistent. Sometimes you can walk across the entire map without getting into a single fight, but other times you can't even walk 2 steps. That's better than always having too many encounters, I suppose. Working Designs didn't alter the gameplay too much other than making some of the bosses later in the game tougher. The graphics are fairly decent for an RPG on the console. Of course, there are cutscenes here, and they're not too shabby looking either. Of course, you'll get the typical crass Working Designs humor here and there, but mostly it sticks to the story. Also, I hope you like your font in all caps. The sound in this game is fine, and the music is excellent. Working Designs did rewrite and perform the opening song with English lyrics.
When all the land is peaceful and there is no further to us at last, then comes a time for love, two hearts colliding into one great hymn.
Lyrical wordsmiths they are not, but I do appreciate their effort. This is also the first game in which Working Designs provided translation notes in the manual, which I always found fun to read. I enjoyed this one quite a bit back when it was new, and honestly I think most people would like it. I really like the translation notes that Working Designs put in the manuals of all their games, starting with the Sega CD. It gave kind of a personal insight that other publishers just weren't doing for their console games back then. I loved how they even talked about the audio being AAD or DDD in the Lunar manual, which I'm sure I was one of the very few people who cared about such things back then, or even now. Basically what that means is that recordings which are AAD were recorded and mixed in analog but then mastered digitally. DDD means that everything was digital through the entire process. Pretty cool if you ask me, which obviously you did. Wait, no, I already did that spiel, didn't I? Anyway, let's get back to the games. I already did that too. Vey was the next game on the Sega CD in 1994, or Vi as the game pronounces it. This is an RPG originally developed by Hertz. No, not the car rental company. Well, maybe. You are Prince Sandor, and giant mechs attack your kingdom as you're getting married and kidnap your bride. You're off to rescue her and defeat the bad guys. The game seems more primitive in its presentation, but don't let that fool you. It's more enjoyable than it might look. Everything is pretty typical for a JRPG as you wander around the towns talking to people. You have 2 different walking speeds, way too slow and a little too fast if you hold down the A button. Your battles are third person and they work well. Everything is extremely easy at first with you wiping out enemies in one hit at the beginning of the game with the most basic weapons. Here's a tip though, grind anyway, and grind a lot. You're gonna need that extra power when you get to the first boss. The random battle encounters are numerous, which is good when it comes to grinding. Unfortunately, it also makes things extremely repetitive. That largely comes from hearing the same mediocre battle music again and again, starting at the very beginning every 20 seconds or so. Working Design says in their translation notes that they made a lot of changes here. For example, in the battles, you might see some scrolling clouds where they didn't scroll in the Japanese version. They replaced some text-only conversations with recorded voice. You now regain all of your HP and magic points when you gain a level, which is super nice. And they also messed with the enemy stats, making things a bit more challenging, which explains how much tougher this boss is compared to the rest of the early part of the game. Later in the game, enemies give out less experience, making it tougher to grind when you really need it. Of course, they also updated the script, adding in fart jokes and stuff. People rarely mention this release, and honestly, probably for a good reason. It's not bad, but you're not missing a ton if you don't play it. Popful Mail also came out in 1994 on the Sega CD. It was originally slated to be called Sister Sonic, but thanks to angry letters written by fans during the game's development, that ended up not happening. This one is an action platformer by Sega Falcom, a joint venture between Sega and, well, Falcom. It's more of an adventure game similar to the Wonder Boy and Monster World series, and it's not a straight-up action game. You don't level up, but occasionally you may need to grind for money in order to buy better weapons, armor, and healing supplies. Throughout your adventure, you'll meet two other characters who will join you, Tato the Wizard and Gaw the, well, he's just Gaw. Each have their different abilities. You can switch between them at any time via the menu. Everyone shares items and gold, but they don't share life bars or equipment. The gameplay is very nice, though I wish they had mapped the menu to the start button instead of button C. Regardless, I find this one endlessly addictive to play, even with the changes that Working Design's made. And there are quite a few changes other than the C button activating the menu that I mentioned. For one, they added constantly scrolling clouds to the Elf Wood segment. Working Designs loves their scrolling clouds. Oh yeah, scroll baby, scroll! The prices in the shops are also higher, sometimes much higher than the Japanese game. Some enemies got stronger and you now receive more damage, which is simply Tuesday over at Working Designs. Yeah, I know, I kind of mingled that quote, but it still applies, it's just, what they do. Lastly, they added a timer which keeps track of how long you've been playing. The faster you beat the game, the more voice outtakes that play after the ending. Even with these changes, I never found the game overly hard. There are certainly tough sections here and there, but overall it's quite nice. This is a game where I think Working Design's more jovial translations actually helps things out. It's a very lighthearted game, and I can't imagine the translation not being what it is. There are a ton of voiceovers in here, and you can turn them off to speed them up if you like. A few of them date the game and might not go over so well these days. Anyway, here are some examples.
Do you sometimes feel less than fresh? I know I do.
This fellow is friends with him? I hope the lad isn't retarded.
God will find that turd-smoking coward and get your mithril back.
Listen to me now and believe me later. I did not think you were so tiny-brained that you would try to follow me.
They even make French people seem normal.
They also recomposed the music for the cutscene since they couldn't get the isolated score for the English dubbing. And they also added some music to the title screen where there was none before. Honestly, the new cutscene music is quite a bit better now and much preferred over the Japanese original.
You can run, but you can't hide! I've got you now, Nutscracker. Your choice. Dead or alive, I still get the $500,000 gold reward.
The graphics are perfect for their time, and the game music is also generally good, even though it's mostly produced by the Genesis itself. I highly recommend this one, and it's way better than the PC Engine version.
Oh, you have no idea how good your pasty white face looks to me right now. My friends are still down there in Boney Rubbler's prison. Can you help them too?
Working Design's final game for the Sega CD would be Lunar Eternal Blue in 1995. This RPG takes place 1,000 years after the first game. That seems to be a theme in RPGs because all the Phantasy Star games took place like 1,000 years apart from each other too. Well, mostly. The gameplay itself is quite similar with a few minor differences here and there. One thing that I noticed is that the battles feel slower and the encounter rate is hugely increased over the original game. Still, I enjoyed playing through this one much more than the first. So you're out to break a spell that's been cast on Lucia and eventually save the world, of course. The game is a slow burner, and that means it takes time for things to happen here. This can be frustrating when you're trying to capture footage for an idiotic YouTube show like GameSack because you want to capture a decent variety in the visuals. Also, don't you love talking about yourself in the second person? The graphics have seen improvements, and the cutscenes often have better animation as well. I also like the music a lot more here, though it's only in mono due to being streamed through the Sega CD's internal sound chips. Expectedly, you'll get the typical translation humor here. Once again, it's in all caps. Some of it dates the game, like this really cool reference to Bill Clinton. The biggest change, though, is the new pay-to-save mechanic. Now, in order to save your game, you need to spend magic experience points, which means you can't just save willy-nilly. The press at the time complained about this change before the game even came out. And of course, some people still complain about it these days. But you know what? It was never once an issue during my playthrough of the entire game. Not once. You earn magic experience points in battle, and unless you usually save after each and every battle, I think you're gonna be okay here. I still don't know why they added it, but for me it was never a concern. Of course, they made virtually every enemy stronger as well, which they probably didn't need to do, as some of the battles can indeed be tedious. Still, despite all of this, I quite enjoyed my time with Lunar Eternal Blue, and it's one of my favorite games on the Sega CD. Working Designs moved to the Saturn from here. They also wanted to release games on the PlayStation as well, but Sony wasn't interested in having RPGs released in the West at the time. Oops. Iron Storm was Working Design's first release on the Saturn, and it came out in 1996. This is a military strategy game based on real historical events. In the campaign mode, you start by choosing one of 3 countries. Then you get to read a very, very long history of events that lead up to the war. After that, you go into your typical hexagonal map, move your pieces around, and attack when you can. The fights take place with real polygons to blow your mind with their 3D-ness. These can be turned off if you feel that they slow things down. I honestly couldn't be less interested in this game. It's just not up my alley, but war buffs will probably love it. There really wasn't much room for Working Designs to alter any translation stuff here. I mean, there could be a fart joke involving Franklin D. Roosevelt somewhere, I don't know. Working Designs added the ability to turn the 3D sequences on and off at any time by pressing the X button. Again, this really isn't my thing, but if you like real-world military strategy games, maybe rent this one from Redbox. Shining Wisdom on the Saturn was next, also in 1996. This is an action RPG developed by Sonic Software Planning, who would later become Camelot. Working Designs incorrectly credits Sonic Team with the development duties in their manual, but they were busy with Nights into Dreams when this came out. Anyway, the game plays a lot like a broken Legend of Zelda, and a lot more boring. You'd think this would be pretty good, and I certainly hoped that back when I bought it brand new upon its release. You walk pretty slow, but you can rapidly tap the B button to build up the gauge at the top of the screen. The higher the number, the faster you move. Once you reach the desired number, you can hold B to keep that speed, even when switching screens. Well, unless you enable manual transmission in the options screen. Yeah. If you do that, you'll have to keep tapping on B to maintain your speed, and I do not recommend this. This whole tap B until you reach your desired speed thing is one of the many reasons this game doesn't succeed at what it tries. Another is that your character just doesn't control well in any aspect, and he has a rather awful reach. You occasionally have to go to the menu screen by pressing start to unequip your sword in order to use something else. Then you need to go back to the menu screen to re-equip your sword. The game just doesn't take advantage of the X, Y, and Z buttons that are on every single Saturn controller ever made. The graphics are kind of a mixed bag. All of the sprites are pre-rendered with a rather ugly, thick black outline. The backgrounds look fairly nice though, however I do wish there were more variety in them. Working designs did make the enemies tougher, which didn't do this poorly controlling game any favors. And yes, the translation is laced with personality. My favorite is this one, which dumps on Beyond the Beyond on the PlayStation, alluding that it's so boring that people give up before finishing it. It's funny that they say that because that's exactly what happened with me in this game. I tried to like it back then, but it was just so boring that I gave up after only about 5 or 6 hours, I think. Anyway, this text is in here because Victor Ireland of Working Designs and Bernie Stolar, who was head of Sony's US Games division at the time, were having a lover's spat. I don't recommend this game, but the European release has a different translation that's more faithful to the original content if you're truly interested. It should be noted that Victor Ireland of Working Designs and Bernie Stolar did not get along. Bernie initially worked over at Sony, as I previously mentioned, and eventually came over to Sega, where he'd be completely in charge. And he was not a fan of the types of games that Working Designs wanted to release and was a constant impediment, or at least he was if you hear Victor Ireland tell the story. That didn't stop Working Designs from releasing some awesome games, however. The much celebrated Dragon Force came out on the Saturn in 1996. This is a strategy game developed by Sega of Japan. This is one with a very steep learning curve. I've never really bothered learning how to play it, but for this episode, I at least put a tiny bit of effort into it. I can see why people like it after they learn it. It's a very high quality game and very deep. Start out by choosing one of several different countries, 2 of which can only be chosen after you beat the game. Each country will have its own story and motivations for you to enjoy. Then you're taken to a screen where you can listen to your generals, give them awards after a victory, talk to other generals you captured, and hopefully recruit them and things of that nature. Then there's the map screen where you decide where to move and what to attack. This part I feel could be a lot more straightforward. Anyway, you have to first select deploy and then select the generals that you want to send and which to leave behind to guard your castle. Then of course you have to tell them where to go. If you encounter an enemy along the way, you get to fight them. Here, you select your method of attack and defense as your troops duke it out. Your general can even use a special move once your bar is fully charged. This part of the game is really fun. Of course, there are some liberties that Working Designs took with the translation as usual. As far as the gameplay goes, they added some shortcuts which can be used with the X, Y, and Z buttons that you'd otherwise have to navigate through menus for in the Japanese version. Overall, even with my limited grasp on this game, I like it a lot more than Vasteel, and certainly more than Ironstorm. You'll usually be able to find a few copies of Dragon Force at any given garage sale, so be sure to check it out. This was also released in Europe by Sega, but it uses Working Designs translation. Albert Odyssey was their next release, and it came to the Saturn in mid-1997. Ooh, look at those Mode 7 graphics! This is a full-fledged RPG, and their only one released on the Saturn. It was originally developed by Sunsoft. Sadly, you don't play as Albert going on his Odyssey, but instead you play as some kid named Pike. You were rescued 10 years ago as a baby from a burning village after your parents were killed.
In ancient times, magic masters created the mystic kingdom of Fargasta.
As far as the gameplay goes, it's standard fare with random battles and whatnot. The main problem here is that the random battles happen a lot, and worse, they're extremely slow. Aside from that, they're quite easy, with you blocking most of the attacks. Still, it's extremely tedious, especially with the very infrequent save points. According to Working Designs translation notes, they not only sped up the load times to the battles compared to the Japanese original, but cut down the encounter rate as well. They also made improvements to your character's walking speed. Man, the Japanese version must be absolutely insufferable. At least you get to enjoy a rather colorful translation. Actually, colorful is kind of an understatement. They went absolutely crazy with this one. I'm guessing that probably over 75% of the dialogue is completely made up with attempts at humor, with a lot of it not aging tremendously well, as you can imagine. Yikes. The graphics are mostly super good 2D art, and the music is mostly great as well. I never got very far into this one as the battles were just too frustrating to deal with, even though the game itself is easy. It's too bad, because if this game were more responsive, it'd probably be remembered as good instead of mediocre. I'd honestly rather play Vi. Working Design's first game for the PlayStation was RayStorm, and it came out under their Spaz label in 1997. That's right, Spaz. This new label of theirs was dedicated to more action-oriented offerings. This is a vertical shooter developed by Taito, and it's the sequel to Rayforce, also known as Layer Section, also known as Galactic Attack. It plays similar to Galactic Attack in that you have a normal shot as well as a reticle which can lock onto enemies. The game is full of polygon graphics instead of 2D. I'm not usually a fan of shooters that use polygons in this style. Since the view is angled, that means the control of your ship gets slower the further up or into the screen it goes. Otherwise, this game looks pretty cool, and we all wanted 3D everything back then. Fortunately, we as a society, well, many of us, grew out of that nonsense and understand that 2D is plenty fine. Working Designs made it so you need to complete each level on normal difficulty to get a real ending, otherwise it's just training mode. There really wasn't much of anything to actually translate here. Overall, it's a good shooter, but I don't think it's as good as Galactic Attack. Sega Ages Volume 1 on the Saturn was next in 1997, and it was another Spaz title. This one gives us Space Harrier, Afterburner, and Outrun all on one disc. These were released as individual discs in Japan, but Sega of Europe decided to put them on a single disc, and Working Designs brought that over here after putting their name on it. As a result of being on a single disc, all of the awesome arranged music from Outrun had to be omitted. Weirdly, Working Design's own translation notes in the manual go on and on about how the arranged versions were the tunes that they kept. No? The games here are all perfect ports from their respective Sega arcade games, and I covered them all in much more detail in my Sega Ages episodes. At least Working Designs didn't screw with the gameplay here or add a colorful new translation. It would be funny to see Space Harrier fart though. Still, overall, this is a great disc. Alundra for the PlayStation arrived in early 1998. This is an action RPG by Matrix Software, and this appears to be their first game. Several staff members came over from Climax who developed Landstalker on the Genesis, and if you've played that one, you can tell right away. You play as Alundra, and if you want a Zelda clone on the PlayStation, you really can't do any better than this one. The action is all in real time like any good action RPG, and you even have a jump button. The controls simply could not be more smooth. You have a regular overworld, regular dungeons, and you even get to go inside people's dreams and battle there. There's a lot of puzzle solving in the dungeons, but it's mostly not too overly convoluted. Well, actually, this one took me a few minutes to figure out that I needed to be on the correct path in order to prevent the blocks from falling and blocking my way. The translation in this one doesn't feel as juvenile as some of Working Design's other titles. Just kidding! During the localization process, they gave virtually all of the enemies more HP. You can totally tell as you're hacking away at what seems like forever, even on the most basic enemies. They did make one of the dream sequences a bit easier. Regardless, this one is tons of fun. I really like all of the detail and the artwork of the graphics. However, they aren't very colorful at all. They're mostly dim with a piss yellow tint to a lot of it. The music fits the game well, but I didn't have any desire to break out the soundtrack or anything. The game ended up doing quite well for Working Designs, as their previous bestseller was Lunar on the Sega CD. I recommend giving this a go if you can. The sequel, not so much. Next up was Elemental Gearbolt for the PlayStation, also in 1998. This is a light gun game from Alpha System, but of course you can use a regular controller if you prefer. You have 3 different types of shots that you can cycle through as you play, which do slightly different things, but I usually leave it on the slower, powerful one as I find it the most effective. The game zooms around all over the place, but fortunately there's no reloading your gun or hostages to accidentally shoot. Between levels, you have a chance to power yourself up. The Japanese version of this game is piss easy, so it comes as no surprise that Working Designs tampered with the difficulty. Now the game is extremely difficult, even on the lowest setting. I feel that they overcompensated on this one. Honestly, I'm surprised that they didn't release this one under the Spaz label since it's an action game and all. They did do some voice work for the cutscenes, but they weren't able to make the story very sensical.
We have to attack! I've already had a perfect new uniform created for our military! Oh, he's just like his mother.
Maybe Working Designs feels that any game with animated cutscenes and voice work is an RPG by default, so therefore not to be released under Spaz. Not that I think they should have a separate label at all, mind you. They really shouldn't. The graphics are nice and move fluidly. The music is outstanding and ethereal, definitely the highlight of this one. Ah, good old Spaz. Now, that word doesn't have quite the same connotation here as it does in, say, Australia, but it still gives me the image of a kid ODing on sugar and just becoming so crazy that it can only play action games. Ooh! I just don't understand why they need a different brand label for a different genre of game. It's just dumb. Anyway, let's take a look at another action game. Thunder Force 5 Perfect System came to the PlayStation in 1998, and sadly it did get released under the Spaz label. This is a horizontal shooter from Technosoft that originated on the Saturn. This is actually my first time playing the PlayStation version. It's a good shooter, though I've always enjoyed it less than parts 2, 3, and 4. That's right, I like Thunder Force 2 more. Still, this one is ambitious with a new 32-bit power at its disposal, and it tries to do a lot of things like have bullets everywhere in 3D space. Only some of them can hurt you, but I think it makes the screen look too cluttered. This one is more or less just like the Saturn version, except that some weapons, like the Wave, have true transparency instead of a dithered mesh. However, there are some graphics that are missing from this scene compared to the Saturn. Also, the sound effects are all much louder now, with exciting reverb just because. There's an intro now with English voice that is mixed very poorly with the sound and music totally drowning out the narration at times.
Suddenly declared war on the entire unknown.
Yikes. Working Designs didn't do much here other than limit the training mode to 4 stages and add a bit of English text here and there. I'm glad they didn't fix the weird voices that announced the boss as saying things like how it died 3 times and was reborn twice.
It died 3 times and was reborn twice.
Technically that means this boss should still be dead, right? Unless it died twice in a row at the start. I don't know how it works, but I love it. Although I don't think it's as good as the other games in the series, it's still fantastic. Working Designs came back to the Saturn for one last game, Magic Knight Rayearth, in December of 1998. This action RPG developed by Sega ended up being the console's final game in North America. You control 3 schoolgirls who are kidnapped into a different land and now you have to save it. It plays about 1 billion times better than Shining Wisdom, but it's not as nice as Alundra. The 2D graphics are very well done, even though this was an early release in Japan. This one took Working Designs 2.5 years to port. One cause was a hard drive crash that they claim lost some of the game's source code, but other sources point to it only damaging some of the full motion video cutscenes. They also spent quite some time powering up all of the enemy characters and even making them faster because, you know, that's what gamers want. Not to mention the usual glib rewrites of certain portions of the script. They did add more save slots though. They also reduced the amount of unskippable voice acting, for which I'll always be eternally grateful since it really slowed down the beginning of the game. I enjoy playing this one, and it was worth it to follow it through to the end. They were back on the PlayStation Next with Lunar's Silver Star story complete. For some reason, GameArts decided to remake the first Lunar game instead of making something new. It's remade from the ground up though, and a lot of changes were made to the game's progression and gameplay system. There are some story changes which almost make it more of a reboot than a remake. Does this game supersede the Sega CD version? Should that one just be forgotten?
People might ask a question such as, which version is the authentic version? Sega CD or Sony PlayStation? Before, Mr. Sega CD tended to often forget things, and he didn't pay attention to the details of things. But nonetheless, he was the storyteller for the first Lunar. This time, Mr. PlayStation, who is more sensible, smarter, and has a better memory, with more capacity for expression, told the history of the Lunar world.
The battles are no longer random, as you can see them roaming around before you fight. Often you can completely avoid them if you keep running. That means no more battles on the overworld map, and it takes longer to grind for stuff, especially in the beginning of the game. The battles are similar to the original, but the AI sucks. It has a tendency to use your magic on even the most basic enemies when a single normal attack would kill them anyway. Still, the game is generally enhanced all around. According to Victor Ireland of Working Designs, nearly 50% of the script was basically copy-pasted from the Sega CD version, though at least this one isn't in all caps. Most of the same voice actors have returned to voice all of their parts here, with the same high-pass filter applied that Working Designs uses on pretty much all their games.
Or were you planning more make-believe adventures with Ramus?
The game now generally gives out less experience than the Japanese version, and the enemy attacks are stronger. Graphically, the game is fantastic, with sharp 2D visuals and tons of color. The music has been redone by the same composer, but I don't know how I feel about it. It's certainly not bad, but it can be quite different than the original stuff. The packaging for this game is insane. The manual is hardbound and features short interviews with several of the Japanese development staff. It also comes with a soundtrack CD and a making of CD for the game. Oh yeah, and I can't forget about the cloth map. I like maps, but why is it cloth? I guess maybe you can use it as a fancy dinner napkin or something. The making of CD has interviews with the Japanese and US staff, but could really use some chapter markers or a fast forward button. The only controls offered here is restarting from the very beginning by pressing select. Haven't these guys ever watched a Laserdisc?
Games with good stories cannot be made without CD-ROM.
Overall, this is still a great game, and probably the preferred way to play Lunar 1.
Check this out!
Silhouette Mirage for the PlayStation came next in 1999, and it was released under the Exciting Spaz label. This is an action platformer from Treasure that appeared first on the Saturn. As per usual for Treasure, it's quirky. Basically, your enemies are classified as silhouettes or mirages. You have a red and a blue side, and your attacks will have different effects depending on which way you're facing, and also whether you're attacking a silhouette or a mirage. Like I said, quirky. Treasure would eventually evolve this concept for their shooter Ikaruga. Every time I play this game, at first I'm like, yeah, I don't know. But then after I spend a little bit of time and adapt to it, I'm like, hell yeah, this is fun! Every time. I never thought that the Saturn version was easy, and this is the first time I'm playing the PlayStation version. Of course, they made it so the enemies do way more damage to you. Things in the shop are also more expensive. But now, you can steal spirit power from the enemies by attacking the same colored one, so that's cool, I guess. The video quality of the FMV scenes is certainly better than the Saturn version, and even the Japanese PlayStation version. The translation seems fine to me and completely acceptable, but then again I have no idea what the Japanese game was going on about. This is still a fun game, and I recommend that you give it a try. Just stick with it for more than 10 minutes until you get used to how it plays.
Reflector! Enemy power status critical.
Reflector!
Working Design stepped into the new millennium with Vanguard Bandits on the PlayStation, released in July of 2000. This is a strategy RPG by Human, who also developed Vasteel. This game is known in Japan as Epic Stella. I can see why they wanted to change the name. It was known as Detonator Gauntlet as it was being localized, but Midway objected since they own the rights to Gauntlet, so here we are. This is a fantastic game that you can jump into right away if you're at all familiar with tactical style games. You move your piece, choose to attack if you can, and, well, I think you get it. However, sometimes when you're about to be attacked, you can also choose a response, like a counterattack, or maybe attempting to avoid the initial attack. You then get a polygonal animation of the battle. These can be turned off if you want the game to go at a faster pace. I keep them turned on because of the translation. Yes, I know Working Designs made some of this stuff up, and that is not an accurate translation, like the lady who speaks like Yoda, for example. But I'll be damned if I don't laugh when an enemy says, "Calgon, take me away," as he's dying, fading out of existence. Yeah, even today. Remember Calgon commercials? If you do, you probably need a colonoscopy.
Calgon, take me away!
Between battles is a lot of conversation between many different characters. You can also buy things, enhance your mech, talk to other members of your party, save, and all that. You can play through the game from 3 different perspectives of the same story, which reminds me of the 3 different Shining Force 3 scenarios in Japan. I wonder if that's where this game got the idea, but then again, it only came out 6 months later in Japan. Overall, the graphics are plenty fine and the music is fantastic. I highly recommend this game. Working Designs had several strategy guides for many of their games. They provided a ton of helpful info, maps, and of course humor directly from Working Designs themselves. There were also interviews and inside information that was also a treat to read, especially if you enjoyed their translation notes in their manuals. Some of the guides were self-published and super fancy, just like you'd expect from them. They look and feel really nice, of course, but they're tough to keep propped open to use as a strategy guide. They are still really cool though. Next was RayCrisis on the PlayStation, released under the Spaz label in 2000. You can take everything I said about RayStorm and apply it to this, except this game is flashier, has a camera that moves around a lot more, moves faster, and is more boss-centric than RayStorm. I'm still not a huge fan of the floaty controls here. Notice how when you stop moving, they snap you back the other way a bit. It's still a fun game though. This one seems to be one of the more bare-bones localizations that Working Designs has done. They put the Spaz label at the front of the game, and they campaigned to keep the Pocket Station functionality that was already present in the Japanese original in just for fun. There's not much that really needed to be changed with this game anyway. It is fitting though that RayStorm was the first game released under the Spaz label, and this one just happens to be the last. Working Designs stepped up to the PlayStation 2 with Gungriffon Blaze at its launch on October 26, 2000. This is a cool mech series developed by Game Arts. I love the first game on the Saturn, and it even has a sequel on the console in Japan. This is the 3rd entry into the series, and it's still fun, but certainly not perfect. You control a mech from a first-person view, and you move around and mainly blow stuff up. But you need to blow up specific things or specific amounts of things within the time limit to succeed. This is not usually as easy as it sounds. If you fail to meet the goals or even die, you can still earn stuff from your time spent in battle. The biggest issue with this game is the control, as it feels completely backwards from what we're all used to these days. You can change some aspects of it on the options screen, but the game's biggest sin is that it doesn't let you change the controls at all during actual gameplay. That's when you need to try stuff out to see what works the most. Actually, a bigger sin is that there's no map anywhere, at least not that I can find, and don't think that I didn't try. Because of this, it can make your mission objectives very difficult to locate. Instead, you just need to roam around barren terrain with very little in the way of recognizable landmarks and hope whatever it is you're looking for is nearby. Still, the action is pretty fun once you get the hang of things. The music is rockin', but the graphics are quite plain. They at least move at a great frame rate. Working Designs didn't have much to change with this one, other than translating the text and the radio chatter, which you can barely understand anyway. I prefer the original game, but this is still worth checking out. Lunar 2 Eternal Blue Complete was released on the PlayStation at the end of 2000. This is a remake for the 32-bit era, just like Silver Star Story Complete was. Many of those features carry over here, like no more random battles. Once again, a lot of the text is the same, even many of the jokes are the same. Thankfully, it also has lowercase letters now too. The cutscenes are faithful to the original, though I'm not really digging the 3D computer animation combined with traditional animation that happens sometimes. The cutscenes themselves feature much of the same dialogue and mostly the same voice actors, though some of it has been re-recorded. Many of the voices are reused from the Sega CD version though.
Tell me, darling, was it good for you? Tell me, darling, was it good for you?
The graphics are once again super nice with crisp 2D visuals and tons of colors. They didn't recompose the music this time around, fortunately. However, they did add some reverb to the audio, which will heighten your enjoyment for sure. You know what I always say, if it doesn't have any reverb, it's just not worth listening to. The packaging is even more insane than the first Lunar Complete game. You get a hardbound manual with more interviews and whatnot, a full soundtrack CD, a few tiny paper standees of some of the characters, and a very weighty replica of Lucia's pendant. Not really sure what I'm supposed to do with this stuff. Let's not forget another making of disc with more interviews and whatnot.
Rather than do a literal translation, we try to do the translation, find out the spirit of what was said, and then write in that same spirit in English, so it feels natural.
If you pre-ordered the game, you also got the galleon punching puppet. Such an odd little trinket. Working Designs made some good changes to the game, like the ability to access up to 30 save slots per memory card. They also added the ability to turn off the battle voices, which I am very thankful for because they can get annoying pretty fast. If you have the ability to play this one, definitely make sure you do so. I should also mention the Unworked Designs project. These are basically patches for a lot of the Working Designs games, which make them play more like the Japanese original but keeps the English text intact. As of this video, 11 games have patches, including Lunar 2 Eternal Blue Complete here. There was also an Alex punching puppet which didn't get released. This was to tie into the PC version of Lunar 1 that Working Designs was supposedly making entirely in-house. That game got cancelled and so did the Alex punching puppet. Anyway, let's finish up the rest of these games. Jumping back to the PlayStation 2, Working Designs brought us Silpheed: The Lost Planet in 2001. This is a sequel to Silpheed on the Sega CD, but this one was developed by Treasure. It's a shooter presented at an angle like Rayforce and RayCrisis, and once again, I'm not a fan of that view. However, at least this one doesn't bounce me back in the opposite direction a bit when I stop pressing left or right. Before each mission, you equip one weapon for the left side of your ship and one for your right. Just like Silpheed on the Sega CD, almost all of the weapons in the game besides the most basic Vulcan is absolutely trash. It plays very similar to the Sega CD game, but obviously with much improved graphics. Since it's from Treasure, of course, it's a bit more boss-centric. About midway through each level, you dock and can switch your weapons. You only get one life, and if you continue, it's all the way back to the beginning of the level for you. As I said, the graphics aren't bad at all. They're really sharp, and they run at a constant 60 frames per second. I like a lot of the music as well. Working Designs removed a lot of the slowdown that was present in the Japanese version and added analog control, though I still use the D-pad as it just feels better for me in a shooter. I'm not sure if Working Designs did the translation themselves or not, as they spelled civilization the British way, and the voices often say Z instead of Z. Both of these things seem very unlike something Working Designs would do. Speaking of voices, there's quite a bit of voice chatter. There are a lot of similar phrases to the Sega CD game, and I imagine that's quite intentional. As a game, it's far, far better than the Sega CD version, but it didn't have the same wow factor in its own time that that one did. Working Designs returned to the original PlayStation one last time with Arc the Lad Collection. This has Arc the Lad 1, 2, 3, and Arc Arena Monster Tournament included, all for the price of a regular release. In fact, it was Sony who demanded that they do it this way, or they wouldn't let them do it at all.
And when we approached it that way with Sony of Japan, they were interested in talking to us and licensing the game to us.
Anyway, the games themselves are strategy RPGs from G-Craft. The battles are pretty swift, which I really like. The first one is one of the earliest games for the console when it launched in Japan, and as a result is fairly short. The next two games definitely make up for that. Hell, Arc the Lad 3 takes up 2 discs just by itself. Arc Arena Monster Tournament allows you to have monsters battle and level up that you've captured while playing Arc the Lad 2 using your game saves. The graphics are mostly 2D, and they look like they could be done on the Saturn with all of the dithering, not that that's a bad thing. The third game transitions to polygons, and to me it just doesn't look as nice, and the game feels a hair slower too. Still though, it plays perfectly fine. The translation seems well done, and a bit reserved for Working Designs. Hahaha, just kidding, I fooled you again. They added dual memory card and dual shock support like usual. Oddly, all of the voices are still in Japanese in all of the games. The voices only happen during the battles, and you can turn the battle voices off, thankfully. The music in each of the games is quite good, so there's that. Of course, you get another hardcover manual which features a lot of useful information and... wait, what? Yeah. You also get some bonus stuff similar to Lunar too. The Making of CD actually has an interface this time, which is pretty neat. This is a great collection and quite the bargain at its original price, so I recommend picking this one up on your way home from work tomorrow. Working Designs' final game ever was Growlancer Generations on the PlayStation 2 in 2004. Or is it Growlancer? Growlancer? Probably Grow. This contains both Growlancer 2 and Growlancer 3 for the price of a single game. Again, Sony made them include both games as a single release, which did not bode well for Working Designs' monetary future. These games are strategy RPGs. They're a bit different in that you usually don't have to tell the characters where to move. They can take care of that on their own. There are lots and lots of dialogue scenes. Sometimes it almost seems like a visual novel. There's nearly 10 hours of voice dialogue across the two titles.
It's time to change shifts.
As a game, I can't really get much into them personally. It's just not very interesting to me. However, I love the incredibly sharp graphics and excellent artwork that's all over the place. There's clearly a lot of work that went into this one. Working Designs made plenty of quality of life improvements, such as an auto battle mode, several menu improvements, and the like. This game was extremely delayed, which, as you know, was a theme with the company. That certainly didn't help things, and this game was just the final straw, though they didn't know it at the time.
This'll be a doozy! Good job, team!
And there you go, that was all 29 releases by Working Designs. They folded in 2005, and Victor Ireland started up a new company in early 2006 called Gaijin Works. They're still in business today, but not exactly the most prolific company out there. Victor is also a pinball enthusiast who sells mods and parts for pinball machines at a website called Pinball Monk, or pinmonk.com. So what do you think of Working Designs? Do you get really pissed off because their translations aren't always completely literal? Or do you just relax and enjoy the games for what they were? I think I fall into the latter half of that category. Anyway, let me know, and in the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. Hello and welcome to GameSack. On today's episode, we're going to take a look at Bill Clinton's favorite games. And you can always tell which games he likes because they have a white stain on them.
In ancient times, 3 video game consoles battled for supremacy of the 16-bit landscape.
You want to release games, do you? Well, not on my
So listen to me now and watch me in 2 weeks. Thank you for watching GameStack, you flabby little girly person.